Before I start this story, there's something you need to understand about Yellowstone. After dark, most people only know the park in daylight. They know the crowds, the wooden boardwalks full of tourists in expensive hiking clothes they bought the day before. They know the buses pulling up in long lines, the phones held high, the kids leaning too far over rails while parents tell them not to get too close to the hot springs. They know the bison causing traffic jams because somebody decided the middle of the road looked like a good place to stop and take pictures. During the day, Yellowstone doesn't feel mysterious. It feels crowded, loud, almost manageable. Like the wilderness has agreed, for a few hours, to let itself be watched. But that's not what Yellowstone is at night. At night, the roads empty out, one by one. The engines disappear. The voices go with them. The visitor centers lock their doors. The campgrounds get quieter. The boardwalks turn into narrow, pale lines floating over dark water and steam. And then, somewhere between the last sunset photograph and the first hour after midnight, the entire park seems to remember what it is. Something vast, something old, something that never belonged to people in the first place. When the wind moves through the trees out there, it doesn't sound like leaves. It sounds like breath passing through teeth. When fog settles over the road, it doesn't drift the way fog should. It hangs, as if it's listening. And once the night gets deep enough, once the radio chatter thins out, and the roads go black, except for your own headlights, even the smallest sound starts to feel wrong. A branch snapping 100 yards away sounds like it came from just outside your window. Water bubbling in a thermal basin can sound like whispering. And footsteps, if you hear footsteps at night, in a place where no one is supposed to be, carry farther than they should. I didn't know any of that when I took the job. At the time, I thought I was taking the kind of position people take when they want to reset their life. Somewhere remote, somewhere quiet, somewhere a bad year can't follow you. I thought the park would feel empty. What I didn't understand yet was that empty and unoccupied are not the same thing. 3 months before I arrived in Yellowstone, I was living in Denver and working as a paramedic. I had been doing that job for almost 6 years, long enough to stop romanticizing it. That's one of the first illusions that goes. People who've never worked emergency response imagine constant chaos, sirens, adrenaline, life or death decisions every minute of the night. But most of it is less cinematic than that. Most of it is procedure layered over exhaustion. Repetition made tolerable by training. You stop asking whether something is tragic. You ask whether the airway is clear. You stop looking too long at faces. You look at pulse oximeters, blood pressure cuffs, respiration rate. You learn how to make your voice sound calm when someone is screaming. You learn how to move fast without appearing rushed, and if you do it long enough, something in you starts splitting the world into categories: treatable, untreatable, transport, time of death. Routine saves you. It has to. Because the moment every call feels personal, you don't last. For years, I lasted. Then there was the girl. It was early spring. Rain coming down just hard enough to make the road slick. A hiking accident in a state park west of the city. A family from Arizona. Father, mother, daughter. The daughter slipped near a ridge trail where the ground had softened from runoff. Fell farther than anyone thought survivable. But when we reached her, she was still alive. Barely. That's the problem with barely. It creates hope in places where there shouldn't be any. We got her into the ambulance. I remember mud on the side of the stretcher. Her father climbing in with us because he wouldn't let go of her hand. I remember the mother outside, screaming at nobody in particular. One park ranger trying to keep her from climbing into the back after us. The father kept asking the same question. Not loudly, not hysterically, just over and over, in a voice that was somehow worse because it was trying to stay calm. She's going to be okay, right? Tell me she's going to be okay. I told him we were doing everything we could. And that was true. It just wasn't enough. I can still remember the exact point when the monitor changed. That small shift in tone. That flatness. The way the sound entered the ambulance and changed the air. Most people think death feels dramatic in a room. What they don't tell you is how often it just feels final. Not loud, not cinematic. Just 1 second different from the one before it. 1 second where the body in front of you stops being a person you can help and becomes something else. Something beyond procedure. I remember the father looking at the monitor, then at me, then back at her. I remember the wet smell of rain and antiseptic in the ambulance. I remember the red light from traffic signals moving over his face as we drove. And I remember knowing, very clearly, that no amount of training gives you the words for that moment. Afterward, I worked 2 more shifts, because that's what you do when you don't know yet that something in you has started breaking. I started sleeping less, then sleeping badly, then not really sleeping at all. At first, it was just replaying details. The father's voice, the monitor, the mother outside the ambulance door. Then it became other things. I'd be washing dishes and hear someone say, "Help me." I'd be half asleep and hear a child ask, very clearly, "Am I going to die?" I'd turn around, and of course, no one would be there. But once your brain crosses that line, once it starts carrying voices home with you, everything else follows. I started missing small things at work. Not fatal things. Nothing serious enough to report, but enough that I noticed. Enough that my supervisor noticed too. He brought me into his office one morning and shut the door. He didn't do the fake empathy voice some managers use when they want to sound human. He just folded his hands on the desk and said, "You need time off." I could have argued, could have told him I was fine, could have lied. Instead, I nodded. Because the truth was, I had started dreading silence, and that's not something you can afford when your whole job depends on hearing correctly. The Yellowstone listing appeared while I was sitting alone in my apartment. 2 weeks later, my lease was nearly up. The place looked exactly like what happens when someone stops imagining a future inside a room. Half-packed boxes, a sink full of dishes I had no real intention of washing, takeout containers, a framed print still leaning against the wall, because I never got around to hanging it. I had spent the previous week pretending I was considering options: job boards, short-term rentals, calls with my sister that ended with some version of, "I just need to figure a few things out." But the truth was, I didn't want options. I wanted distance. Distance from the city. Distance from the ambulance. Distance from every intersection that looked familiar enough to trigger memory before thought. And that's why the Yellowstone posting landed the way it did. Seasonal park ranger, night patrol unit, housing included. The wording was dry, almost bureaucratic, but the details underneath it promised the only things I cared about by then: isolation, routine, a place where nobody would ask me to relive what had happened in the back of an ambulance. Most people, I think, would see night patrol in Yellowstone and imagine danger, animals, weather, getting stranded in the dark. What I saw was the opposite. No sirens, no apartment walls, no city noise outside my window at 3 a.m, just trees, roads, radio, work. It sounded clean, simple, like a life stripped down to its functional parts. So I applied. 2 days later, they called. I accepted before I could think too hard about it. The drive into Yellowstone took almost 10 hours, long enough to feel like the country was rearranging itself around me. At first, it was all familiar infrastructure: interstate lanes, gas stations, chain restaurants, signs for suburban exits I would never take. Then, the city thinned. Buildings got shorter. Traffic loosened. The road widened in some places, narrowed in others. And by the time I crossed into the last long stretch before the park, even the landscape seemed quieter. The mountains came first, not suddenly, more like a presence gathering at the edge of everything else. Then the forests, dense stands of pine and lodgepole, dark and uniform from a distance, but up close, full of texture, bent trunks, patches of old snow in shadow, the occasional burned section where black trees still stood like charred bones. I remember rolling the window down at one point, just to smell the air. Colder than the city, cleaner, pine sap, wet earth, stone, something mineral underneath it. The kind of air that makes you realize how stale everything you've been breathing actually was. By the time I reached the park entrance, the sun was already lowering behind the mountains. The sky had gone from pale blue to that deep amber color that makes everything look briefly more beautiful than it really is. The ranger station sat just inside the entrance road, a broad wooden building with a gravel lot and a flagpole out front. There were 2 ranger trucks parked beside it, both dust-coated and practical-looking. Not the kind of vehicles anyone ever photographed for brochures. No tourists nearby, no line of visitors. Just the sound of gravel under my tires when I pulled in and shut the engine off. Then silence. No signal on my phone. No vibrations. No messages. For the first time in weeks, nobody could reach me. I sat there for a full minute, with both hands still resting on the steering wheel. Not because I was tired, because I could feel something unclenching in me. At the time, I mistook that feeling for relief. Ranger Cole met me on the porch. He looked like a man the park had been wearing for years. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. Though with people like him, it was always hard to tell. Weather and altitude and decades outside strip age down to usefulness. Gray beard cut short. Forearms tanned darker than the rest of him. The sort of face that looked permanently narrowed against wind and distance. His uniform was neat, but old in the way functional things get old. Faded, repaired, still doing its job. "You the new night patrol?" he asked. "That's me." "Long drive?" "About 10 hours. He nodded once, like that was about what he expected. "People come a long way to get out here." There was no smile with it, no joke, just the sort of statement a person makes when they have seen too many versions of the same arrival. I asked if that was common. He looked past me toward the road for a second before answering. Common enough. Then he picked up one of my duffel bags before I could tell him I had it and said, "Let's show you the cabin before you lose the light." The cabin sat about half a mile from the main station, tucked among pine trees that made it nearly invisible from the road. Not picturesque, not rustic in the curated tourist brochure sense, just small and useful. 1 room, wood stove, narrow bed, desk against the wall with a radio unit bolted to it, a metal coat hook near the door, a tiny bathroom attached in the back. The place smelled like smoke worked deep into the wood over many winters. Old paper, dry dust. It was cleaner than I expected, but not empty of history. You could tell other people had lived there before me. The floorboards had a path worn into them. The desk surface carried scratches from years of radios and keys and maybe knives. One of the window latches had been repaired more than once. Cole set my bag down just inside the door and let me look around. Outside, the trees shifted in the wind. Not much, just enough to make the shadow patterns move across the window. No cars, no voices. No distant hum of a city carrying farther than it should. Just one sound, far off and thin in the evening air. A wolf. I stood still long enough to hear it again. Then a second one answered from farther away. Cole stayed on the porch while I listened. "You'll get used to it," he said. "The wolves?" He shook his head. "The quiet." Something about the way he said quiet made it sound less like a condition and more like a thing. We went back to the station before full dark because, as Cole put it, I'd rather explain things where the coffee's still hot. Inside, the ranger station felt older than it was. Wood panel walls, maps tacked over corkboards, some new, some curling at the corners. Shelves packed with field binders, batteries, flare kits, old radios, and laminated emergency guides. A coffee machine sat on a side table, humming softly. It looked like it had been replaced often enough to keep working, but never with anything modern. The whole place had that specific institutional smell of places that are occupied year-round, but never fully refreshed. Coffee, printer toner, wet fabric, dust warmed by old heaters. Cole sat at a desk scarred by decades of use and opened a metal drawer. He took out a clipboard. I assumed this was finally going to be the practical part. Patrol maps, wildlife reports, emergency codes. He slid the clipboard across the desk to me. "At night," he said, "the park runs a little differently." The page clipped to it had a title in bold block letters: Night Patrol Guidelines. Below that, 10 rules. I remember reading the first line and feeling something small and cold move through me. Not fear exactly, just the first hint that I had misunderstood the nature of the job. Rule 1. If you see hikers on any closed trail after midnight, do not approach them on foot. Use the vehicle speaker first. If they do not respond, leave the area. I looked up. Closed trails? There are a lot of them, Cole said. And people still use them? Sometimes. Tourists? He paused. Not always. That answer sat between us longer than it should have. I looked back at the page. The wording bothered me more than the content did. Not because it was strange, but because it was specific, in a way that suggested repetition. Somebody had learned this more than once. I kept reading. Rule 2. If anyone asks for directions to the old Norris Road Ranger Station, do not answer the question. Tell them the road is closed and return to your vehicle. I frowned. What's that mean? The old Norris station burned down. When? 1993. That made me look back down at the rule again. Then why would anyone ask? Cole picked up his coffee mug and took a sip before answering. That's the wrong question. What's the right one? He set the mug back down carefully. Why would anyone ask after midnight? I didn't know what to say to that, so I kept reading. Rule 3. If you hear someone calling for help from beyond a thermal basin after 1 a.m., radio the location and wait for backup. Do not leave the vehicle. That one I tried to rationalize immediately, because the park had real dangers. visible dangers. Heat-thinned ground, pools hot enough to strip flesh. Areas tourists wandered into every year because they thought warning signs were suggestions. Because of the ground? I asked. Cole nodded. Partly. Partly? He didn't elaborate. I hated how quickly I was starting to notice that pattern. Rule 4. If you encounter a group standing still and facing the tree line, do not count them more than once. I read that twice, then a third time. I don't understand that one. You won't until you do. That's not helpful. No, he said evenly. It isn't. The room stayed very quiet after that. Outside, the wind hit one side of the building and moved on. I went to the next rule. Rule 5. If you see a child alone anywhere in the park after midnight, do not allow them to enter your vehicle. That one stopped me completely. I looked up so fast the clipboard edge clicked against the desk. Okay. No. Cole didn't react. No? If I see a child alone in this park after midnight, I'm not leaving them out there. Then you shouldn't take this job. He said it so flatly, it took me a second to understand he was serious. That's insane. Call it in, he said. Mark the location. Wait for daylight. That could get somebody killed. Something shifted in his face then. Not anger, not annoyance. Something more like old fatigue. Real children, he said slowly, aren't out there after midnight. We stared at each other for a few seconds. I wanted him to smile, or admit he was screwing with me. He didn't. And I think that was the moment when the room started to feel colder. Because I realized I was sitting across from a man who completely believed what he was saying. The remaining rules were no better. Rule 6. If your radio transmits your own voice giving instructions you did not say, change channels immediately. Rule 7. If you see lights moving low in the fog near the geyser fields, turn off your spotlight and leave the road slowly. Rule 8. If someone appears wet in freezing temperatures, ask only one question. Are you injured? If they answer anything else, return to your vehicle. Rule 9. If a person repeats the same request 3 times without changing tone, do not respond again. Rule 10. If you return to the same trail marker twice in less than 10 minutes, remain in the vehicle until sunrise. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, I wasn't unsettled because the rules sounded impossible. I was unsettled because they sounded practiced. This wasn't folklore. It wasn't written in the tone of a ghost story. No dramatic flourishes. No, beware. No, under no circumstances, unless it served a function. It read like what it was pretending to be. Procedure. That's what made it worse. If somebody had handed me a list of local legends, I could have filed it mentally under hazing. Weird ranger superstition. Something to laugh about later. But this wasn't framed that way. This was a working document. I set the clipboard down slowly. Are these actual procedures? Yes. For what, exactly? For night patrol? No, I said. I mean, what are they for? Cole stood and walked to the wall map. His hand rested lightly on the area north of the geyser basin, then moved toward a line of trails cutting across forest and ridge. This park is bigger than people understand, he said. Over 2 million acres. Roads, forest, water, basin fields, that country, burn zones, places tourists see, and places they never do. He looked back at me. Most of it is manageable during the day. And at night? He was quiet for a second too long. At night, the park stops trying to explain itself. I remember thinking that line sounded rehearsed, not poetic, used, like it had been said before to someone else across the same desk. He slid the keys to one of the ranger trucks toward me. Metal ring, heavy fob, park vehicle tag scratched from use. You start patrol tonight. What time? Midnight. I looked toward the window. It was already getting dark enough that the trees outside were losing detail. I'm just starting tonight? He nodded. You'll do the South Loop first. Main road, thermal perimeter, closed access roads. Easy route. Alone? Yes. I almost, then. Not because anything was funny. Because it was either that or admit something I didn't want to say out loud. That seems like a lot of trust for someone you met an hour ago. Cole's expression barely changed. It's not trust. What is it? Pattern. He picked up his mug and took the last sip of coffee. Then he set it down and added, You won't understand that yet either. That should have been the moment I walked out. If I'm honest, I can see that now, but exhaustion makes strange things seem manageable. So does wanting, very badly, for a place to work out. I had driven 10 hours. My life in Denver was in pieces. My phone had no signal. The cabin was warm. The trees were quiet. Somewhere in me, the part that still wanted things to make sense kept insisting there was a practical explanation for all of it. Strange local policy, park superstition, old stories weaponized into procedure, because that's how people in remote places make uncertainty feel smaller. That's what I told myself. And because I wanted to believe it, I stayed. I tried to sleep for a few hours before patrol. I failed. The cabin was too quiet. That was the problem. People talk about silence like it's peaceful, but real silence has weight to it. In cities, you are never fully alone with your own head. There is always traffic, distant voices, sirens, television through walls, some mechanical reminder that the world is still moving around you. In the cabin, there was nothing, just the stove ticking softly as it cooled, wind brushing the trees, the occasional crack of old wood settling. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening hard enough that every small sound became meaningful. Once, Around 11:30, I could have sworn I heard footsteps outside the cabin. I sat up and listened. Nothing. Then the wind shifted, and the trees moved, and I told myself that was all it had been. At 11:50, I gave up on sleep, put the keys in my pocket, and walked back to the station through the trees with a flashlight in my hand. The beam looked weak in all that dark. The ranger truck smelled like dust, vinyl, old coffee, and damp wool. The sort of smell that only belongs to work vehicles used in every season and never fully aired out. I set the clipboard on the passenger seat. The rules looked more absurd under the dome light than they had in the office. I remember staring at Rule 5 again. If you see a child alone anywhere in the park after midnight, it made me angry in a way the others didn't. Because it wasn't just strange. It contradicted every instinct I had left. I started the engine. The headlights flared across the gravel, then caught the trunks of the trees beyond the lot. Pale bark, black shadow, fog low near the ground in strips. The radio hissed softly with standby static. I checked the clock on the dash. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes. I could still have gone back inside and told Cole the whole thing was insane. I could still have walked away. Instead, I pulled the truck into gear and rolled out onto the road. Midnight in Yellowstone didn't feel like a time. It felt like a threshold. The road curved away from the ranger station and disappeared into forest almost immediately. My headlights carved out 2 pale lanes, and nothing beyond them seemed fully real. Fog drifted across the asphalt in long, uneven ribbons. The trees looked packed too tightly together, trunks vertical and dark as bars. The radio crackled once, with another ranger checking in on the west road, then went quiet again. I drove slower than I needed to, not because I was cautious, because everything around me made speed feel wrong. There are places where darkness just means lack of light. This wasn't one of them. This darkness felt occupied. Not with movement exactly, with possibility. The kind that sits just outside your vision and waits to see if you'll make the first mistake. Somewhere far off, a coyote barked. Then, nothing. I kept glancing at the clipboard, at the rules, at the road, trying to laugh internally at myself for taking any of it seriously. Then, about 20 minutes into the patrol, my headlights crossed a set of footprints. Fresh ones. They came from the left side of the road, out of the trees, crossed both lanes, and disappeared into the start of a trail marked closed after dusk. I slowed instinctively. The beam from the headlights caught the metal trail sign and made it shine pale white against the dark. The footprints looked recent, not half filled by wind or softened by old frost. Sharp edges, deep heel marks. Someone had crossed there minutes ago, maybe less. I pulled the truck to a stop. The engine idled softly beneath me. The forest beyond the sign was black, No flashlight beam, no visible hiker. Just the trail, the tracks, and the feeling, sudden and immediate, that the first rule had stopped being theoretical. I looked from the footprints to the clipboard on the seat, then back to the trail. And for the first time that night, I believed the rules might be there for something other than comfort. I sat there with the truck idling and my headlights fixed on the closed trail sign. The footprints disappeared into darkness so complete, it felt like the beam of the headlights had reached the edge of something and stopped. There was no flashlight deeper in the trees, no reflective gear, no movement that I could see, just the prints, fresh enough that the edges still held. Whoever had crossed there hadn't done it hours ago. They were either still on the trail or standing somewhere just beyond the reach of the light, watching me hesitate. I reached over and picked up the clipboard from the passenger seat. Rule 1. If you see hikers on any closed trail after midnight, do not approach them on foot. Use the vehicle speaker first. If they do not respond, leave the area. The wording bothered me again. Not if you think you hear someone. Not if you suspect illegal activity. If you see hikers. As if I was expected to. As if this was routine. I looked back at the trail entrance. The sign that read, "Closed after dusk," leaned slightly to one side. One bolt rusted, the white letters reflecting hard in the headlights. Beyond it, the trail narrowed quickly into pine and shadow. The forest floor looked black and damp, the kind of ground that would swallow sound. My hand hovered near the door handle. Instinct said, "Get out." That had been my job for years. Go toward the problem, not away from it. But this wasn't an ambulance call. And there was something about the way the trail looked that made the simple act of stepping out of the truck feel wrong. Like the dark beyond the sign wasn't empty space. Like it had weight. I reached for the vehicle mic instead. The speaker gave a burst of static before coming alive. "This is Yellowstone Night Patrol," I said, and my own voice sounded thinner than usual through the truck speaker. "The trail is closed. If you're on the path, return to the road immediately." The words rolled into the trees and vanished. Nothing came back. No movement. No answering light. I waited. The engine hummed. My own breathing sounded too loud in the cab. Then, after maybe 10 seconds, a shape moved between two trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting branches. Then a second shape appeared. Human. 2 figures. Walking slowly, deeper along the trail instead of back toward me. They never turned, never looked toward the truck, just kept going. My chest tightened. They looked wrong immediately, not in some obvious supernatural way, just wrong in the way people look when something about them resists context. Their clothes were too dark for hikers. No reflective strips, no headlamps, no backpacks that I could see. Their stride matched too perfectly, like two people had been told to walk the same way and were focusing too hard on doing it. I picked up the mic again. "The trail is closed," I repeated. "Turn around and return to the road." No reaction. One of them moved behind a tree trunk and disappeared from sight for a second. The other kept walking. Then the first emerged again. Only now they looked farther apart than they should have been, like the trail between them had stretched without either one actually changing pace. I felt a rush of cold move through my arms. My foot came off the brake without me realizing it. The truck rolled back a few inches on the road. That was enough. I set it in drive and backed away from the trail mouth without taking my eyes off the figures. They never turned around. Not once. By the time the headlights shifted off the trail entrance, both of them were gone. I told myself there were explanations. Night hikers. People avoiding ranger contact. Maybe they had been drunk. Maybe they were local kids. Maybe the darkness and distance had made the whole thing look stranger than it was. That's what I told myself as I drove on. The problem was, none of those explanations accounted for the way they had moved, or the way the trail had seemed to hold them without sound, or the fact that once I rounded the next bend in the road and looked in the side mirror, I could still see the white gleam of the closed sign, but no footprints leading up to it anymore. I nearly stopped, nearly put the truck in reverse. Instead, I gripped the wheel harder and kept driving. I had only been in the park for a day. Already I could feel the first, most dangerous shift happening. The one where you start doubting the order in which things occurred. That is how places like that get inside you. Not by showing you something impossible, by making you question whether it had been impossible in the first place. The South Loop ran for several miles before it bent west toward one of the thermal basin access roads. The land opened a little there. Less forest, more low ground. Steam in thin white columns rising from dark earth. The smell changed too. Pine gave way to something sharper and more mineral. Sulfur, wet stone, water heated from somewhere too deep to imagine. By day, the basins drew crowds. At night, under ranger lights and moon haze, they looked less like tourist sites and more like open wounds in the ground. Steam drifted across the road in low sheets. The truck headlights cut through it unevenly, creating the illusion of movement, even where there was none. I slowed near the basin perimeter and checked the map clipped to the dash. Routine patrol. Check the barriers. Check the service road. Move on. That's what I was telling myself when the radio clicked with a burst of static. I flinched before I could stop myself. Then a voice came through. Unit 3, check in. Not Cole. Not any voice I recognized. I grabbed the mic. Unit 3 here. Silence. Then static again. Then, state your position. The voice was calm. Male. Middle-aged, maybe. Clear enough that I should have recognized it from orientation if it belonged to one of the other rangers. South Basin Road, I said. Thermal perimeter. A pause. Then the radio crackled, and the same voice said, "Do not stop for pedestrians on Norris access." I frowned. The route map on my dash didn't label anything. Norris access. Not on the section I was driving. I picked up the clipboard and flipped to the rules again, more out of unease than logic. Rule 2. If anyone asks for directions to the old Norris Road Ranger Station, do not answer the question. My eyes went back to the radio. "Who is this?" I asked. The line hissed softly. No response. Then, only static. I changed channels and checked the Ranger frequency list taped to the dash. Nothing unusual followed, but the unease stayed with me, because whoever had spoken hadn't sounded ghostly or distorted or theatrical. He had sounded exactly the way people on radios are supposed to sound. Routine, professional, like someone doing his job. And somehow, that was worse. The road dipped and curved through steam. Visibility dropped for a few seconds at a time. The headlights would fill with white, then clear, then fill again. That was when I saw him, standing at the side of the road, just beyond a low barrier fence. A man, alone, wet. At first, I thought he was one of the steam illusions, a human shape forming from fog and road glare. Then the truck got closer. No illusion. He was real enough to cast a shadow. He wore a dark coat, slick with moisture, hair flattened to his forehead, as if he'd just climbed out of water. His arms hung strangely loose at his sides. He wasn't waving, wasn't stumbling, just standing there, looking toward the road. I braked automatically, then remembered Rule 8. If someone appears wet in freezing temperatures, ask only one question. Are you injured? If they answer anything else, return to your vehicle. The night had dropped below freezing almost an hour earlier. Steam moved behind him in slow ribbons. He should have been shivering. He wasn't. I lowered the window only an inch. Cold air and sulfur drifted in immediately. "Are you injured?" I called. He turned his head toward me. Too smoothly. Not fast. Not jerky. Just with a kind of perfect, unbroken motion that made me think for one strange second of mannequins on rotating platforms. His face was pale in the headlights. Older than I'd first thought. 50s, maybe. Hard to tell with the water shining on his skin. "I'm trying to find the station," he said. Not an answer. Every muscle in my shoulders went tight. "What station?" I asked before I could stop myself. He stepped one pace closer to the fence. Water dripped from the hem of his coat onto frozen ground. "The ranger station on Norris Road," he said. "The old one." My hands tightened around the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles hurt. He looked directly at me now. Not desperate, not frightened, as if he were mildly inconvenienced and expected me to correct that. "You'll want to continue east," I said quickly. The exact line from the rule formed in my mouth before I really thought about it. The man kept staring at me. For a second, I thought he hadn't heard. Then he nodded once. A small, polite acknowledgement. East, he repeated. I raised the window the rest of the way, put the truck in gear, and drove. I did not check the mirror until I was at the next bend. When I finally did, the road behind me was empty. No man, no wet footprints on the pavement where he'd stood. Just drifting steam and the faint outline of the fence. I drove for almost 2 full minutes before I realized my left hand was shaking. Not visibly. Just enough that the truck wheel vibrated under my grip. I told myself he had been some kind of lost visitor, confused and hypothermic. I told myself the old Norris question was some coincidence. But under all that reasoning was a simpler thought, one I couldn't get rid of. He had answered the wrong question too quickly, like he had been waiting for the opening. And the worst part wasn't the question he asked. It was how ordinary he had sounded asking it. No menace, no weird smile. Nothing I could point to later and say, there, that was the part that made it inhuman. Just a wet man in freezing air, asking for a ranger station that had burned down before some of my coworkers were old enough to drive. That's the kind of thing fear feeds on best. Not what is obviously monstrous, what almost passes. The road carried me farther north after that, away from the basins and back into dense timber. The truck headlights bounced off reflective trail posts and park signs. A warning for wildlife crossing, a closure sign near a maintenance pullout, another map station with the paper insert removed for winter. Everything looked ordinary. That was starting to become its own problem. The ordinary parts of the park were making the strange parts harder to dismiss, not easier. If the whole place had looked haunted, I could have written it off as atmosphere. Instead, the road was just a road. The signs were official. The truck was real. The map was accurate, which meant the wrong things happening in between were harder to excuse. Around 1:20 a.m., I reached a long stretch of road, bordered by thin trees on one side and open ground on the other. That's where I saw the group. At first, I thought they were fence posts. 4 narrow vertical shapes in the distance, pale in the headlights. Then the truck got closer. People, standing at the edge of the tree line, not walking, not talking, just facing into the dark between the trunks. My skin prickled immediately. I remembered Rule 4 before I ate mesmo picked up the clipboard. If you encounter a group standing still and facing the tree line, do not count them more than once. There they were, far enough away that I couldn't make out clothing clearly, but close enough to know they were human-sized, maybe adults, one shorter than the others. The truck engine idled low beneath me as I slowed. Don't count them more than once. I stared through the windshield. There were 4. I knew there were 4. My brain had already registered 4 before the rules surfaced in memory. So, why did my eyes keep wanting to check again? That was the worst part of that rule, I realized then. It wasn't difficult because it was confusing. It was difficult because human beings count things automatically. We verify. We check. We make sure we saw correctly, especially at night, especially when we're afraid. I kept my eyes on the steering wheel for a second, then looked up again, very carefully, refusing to focus on individual shapes. The group hadn't moved. No one turned toward the truck. No flashlight. No voices. Just that line of still bodies facing the trees, as if something inside the forest had their full attention. I drove on, slowly, not because I wanted to get closer, but because my body had gone rigid enough that fast movement felt impossible. As the truck passed them, the beam of the headlights shifted across their backs. For one impossible second, I had the sense that the line extended farther than I had seen at first. That there were not 4 shapes, but more. That some of them had been hidden in darkness until the angle changed. I kept driving. Didn't look again. Didn't count. By the time they disappeared in the side mirror, my mouth had gone completely dry. The radio came alive just then, with a crackle sharp enough to make me jump. Unit 3. Cole. I grabbed the mic too fast. Go ahead. There was a pause on his end, as if he had been listening before deciding whether to speak. You on the North Bend? Yes. Another short pause. Keep moving. That's the plan, Treeline hissed softly. Then he said, Don't stop if you see them again. I stared at the dark road ahead. He hadn't asked what I saw. He hadn't asked if I was all right. Just them. You knew they were there? Cole didn't answer directly. Keep moving, he repeated. Then the radio went dead. By then, the night had lost any sense of sequence. I was still following a road, still checking markers, still, technically, doing the job I had been assigned. But the underlying logic had changed. The park was no longer a place I was patrolling. It felt more like a place I had entered, and not yet been judged by. Every turn in the road carried the sense that something might already be waiting there. Not because it had followed me, but because it had always been there, and my headlights were only now catching up to it. That's when fear started feeling physical, not abstract, not this is unsettling. My shoulders ached from how tightly I was holding the wheel. My jaw hurt from clenching. Every time the radio hissed, adrenaline moved through me so fast it felt like nausea. I understood something then that I hadn't understood in the office. The rules weren't frightening because they were strange. They were frightening because they implied repetition. Somebody had written them after seeing each thing often enough to know exactly how not to die from it. And I was out there alone, learning that one scene at a time. At 1:47 a.m., I reached a service turnout overlooking a low meadow and river cut. I pulled over only long enough to check the route map and drink from the thermos Cole had shoved into the cup holder before I left. The coffee was terrible, burnt, bitter, nearly cold, but it gave my hands something to do. Beyond the turnout, fog sat low over the meadow. The kind of ground fog you get near water in freezing temperatures. At first, I only saw the fog. Then, lights moved inside it, low to the ground, faint. Not flashlight beams, not vehicle lights. More like dim lanterns traveling beneath a white sheet. Rule 7. If you see lights moving low in the fog near the geyser fields, turn off your spotlight and leave the road slowly. I was nowhere near the main geyser field now, but the memory of the rule hit hard enough that I reacted before I thought. I killed the spotlight, put the truck in drive, backed out of the turnout slowly, eyes fixed on the fog. The lights didn't rise, didn't come closer. They just moved laterally through the white. 3 of them now, maybe 4, drifting at walking pace where no one should have been walking. Then one stopped, and another. For a second, it looked like all of them had turned toward the road, together. I eased the truck farther back. My heart was beating so hard, I could feel it in my throat. Only when the curve of the road took the meadow out of sight did I finally exhale. I realized then that I had stopped trying to rationalize things. Somewhere between the wet man and the silent group in the trees. That scared me too, because if I believed the rules, then I also had to believe the park contained exactly the sort of night I had hoped a place like this never could. And if I didn't believe them, then I had no explanation for any of it at all. The road back toward the station should have felt easier. Familiar route. No more unplanned stops. Just the truck, the radio, and the dark. Instead, it felt worse. Because by then, I knew the park was capable of producing things I couldn't classify quickly enough to protect myself from them. Around 2:10 a.m., the radio cracked alive again. This time, the voice came through before I reached for the mic. Unit 3, state your position. It was my voice. Exactly my voice. Not close, not similar. Mine. Every flat vowel. Every clipped consonant. The same tired tone I used when I'd been working too long and trying not to sound it. For one frozen second, I just stared at the radio. Rule 6. If your radio transmits your own voice giving instructions you did not say, change channels immediately. My hand moved so fast, I almost knocked the mic into the passenger footwell. I switched channels. Static. Then another ranger voice I didn't recognize. Mid-sentence, talking about a maintenance gate near Mammoth. Normal. Routine. I kept driving. Didn't look at the old channel again. But in the silence that followed, one thought kept looping through my head. If the radio could use my voice after less than one night in the park, what exactly was it listening to? The station lights came into view just before 3 a.m., warm yellow through the trees. Not bright enough to erase the dark, but enough to suggest walls, roofline, structure, human place, human shape. For the first time in hours, relief hit hard enough to hurt. I parked beside the office and shut the engine off. For a moment, I just sat there with both hands on the wheel, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. No footsteps outside, no voices, no children, no wet men asking for places that burned down before I was old enough to vote. Just the soft wind and the smell of hot engine metal. When I finally stepped out, the cold hit my face sharply enough to wake me fully. Cole was waiting inside. He didn't ask how the patrol had gone at first. He poured coffee, set a mug in front of me, then sat across the desk and watched me take the first sip. Only after that did he say, "You see anyone on the trails?" I looked at him over the rim of the mug. "How did you know?" He didn't answer. "Did you leave the truck?" "No." "Good." He nodded once, like that settled the most important part. Then he asked, "Anyone ask about Norris?" I set the mug down slowly. "Yes." "Wet?" "Yes." Cole looked at the map wall instead of at me. "Anyone in the Treeline?" I didn't answer immediately. "That happened too," I said finally. He rubbed one hand along his beard, expression unreadable. Then he stood and walked to the file cabinet in the corner. When he turned back, he had another clipboard in his hand, thicker than the first. He set it on the desk between us. "There's a second set of procedures," he said. "Those are for week 2. I stared at the clipboard, then at him. "Week 2? He nodded. "If you come back tomorrow night, you'll need them." That was how he phrased it. Not when, if. And somewhere inside me, something cold and reasonable understood exactly what he meant. Cole didn't hand me the second clipboard immediately. For a while, he just stood beside the desk, his hand resting on it, like someone deciding whether something needed to be said, or if it would only make things worse. The ranger station was silent, except for the low hum of the old heater in the corner. Somewhere in the building, a pipe clicked softly as the temperature outside continued to drop. I was suddenly very aware of how tired I was. The kind of tired that comes from adrenaline draining out of your body all at once. But underneath that exhaustion was something else. Something sharper. Curiosity mixed with dread. Because if there was a second set of rules, that meant the first night had only been an introduction. Cole finally slid the clipboard toward me. "Don't read it yet," he said. That surprised me. "Why not?" "Because if you read it before you need it," he said, "you'll start seeing things that aren't actually happening." I stared at him. "That doesn't make me feel better." He shrugged slightly. "It's not supposed to." I left the station a few minutes later and walked the short trail back toward my cabin. The path was narrow and barely visible in the moonlight. Pine needles muffled my footsteps. The forest had grown colder since midnight. the air dry and sharp enough that every breath felt clean. Normally, that kind of silence would have felt peaceful. But after the patrol, the quiet had changed. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like the forest was holding something back, like sound itself was being absorbed. Halfway down the trail, I stopped walking. Not because I heard something, because I realized something. The wolves had stopped. When I arrived earlier that evening, I had heard them far off in the valley. Now, the forest was completely still. No wind, no animals, no distant movement. Just trees standing perfectly motionless under the moon. And that kind of silence never happens naturally for long. I walked the rest of the way to the cabin faster than I meant to. The cabin looked different at night. Smaller. The same yellow light from the window cut a narrow rectangle into the darkness between the trees. For a moment, the sight of it gave me a kind of relief that surprised me. A building, a door, 4 walls, something solid after hours of open road and endless forest. The idea of shelter had suddenly become very appealing. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. The quiet inside the cabin felt thicker than outside. The wood stove gave off a faint warmth. The radio unit on the desk blinked softly with a green indicator light. I placed the second clipboard beside it, without opening it. Cole's warning stayed in my head. Don't read it yet. At the time, that sounded like superstition. Later, I would realize it was something closer to experience. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw something from the road. The wet man, the silent group in the trees, the lantern lights drifting through fog. Even the radio replayed in my head, my own voice, speaking words I hadn't said. I lay there staring at the wooden ceiling for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion won. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the wind beginning to move again outside. The trees brushing softly together. A normal sound. A comforting one. At least it was supposed to be. Something woke me. At first, I thought it was the radio. A faint click somewhere in the cabin. Then I realized the sound wasn't inside. It was outside the door. A soft, deliberate tap. I didn't move. The room was still dark, except for the faint glow of the radio indicator. The clock on the desk read 3:41 a.m. Another tap. Not loud, not urgent, just slow, patient. I sat up slowly in the bed. The cabin felt colder now. The fire in the stove had burned low. Another tap came. 3 this time. Knuckles on wood. Whoever it was didn't knock like someone who expected the door to open quickly. They knocked like someone who already knew it would eventually. I looked at the radio. No incoming transmission. No voices. Just the steady green light. The tapping came again. This time closer to the center of the door. I swung my legs slowly off the bed. The wooden floor creaked under my weight. The tapping stopped immediately. I froze. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to press against the walls. Then, a voice came from the other side of the door. A child's voice. "Hello?" My chest tightened instantly. "Is someone in there?" The voice sounded young. 8, maybe 9 years old. Too calm. Not crying. Not scared. Just curious. I stood very still in the middle of the room. The rule came back to me instantly. Rule 5. If you see a child alone anywhere in the park after midnight, do not allow them to enter your vehicle. The rule didn't mention cabins, but the implication was clear. Real children weren't supposed to be out there, especially not at 3:41 in the morning. "Hello?" the voice repeated. A small hand slid across the outside of the door. I heard the skin against the wood. I'm lost. Everything in my body wanted to open that door. Years of paramedic work had wired that response deep. Someone asks for help. You help. You don't question it. You don't hesitate. You act. But another part of me remembered the wet man, the hikers, the radio, and the way Cole had said those words. Real children aren't out there after midnight. The hand slid down the door slowly, then stopped. "Please," the voice said softly, "it's cold." I forced myself to speak without moving closer. "Where are your parents?" Silence. Then the child answered. "They told me to wait by the road." My stomach tightened. "What road?" I asked. A long pause. Then the voice said something that made my blood run cold. "The one you were just on." The door handle moved slightly. Not enough to open. Just enough to test it. Then the hand tapped the wood again. 3 soft knocks. I didn't move. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. It was impossible to tell. Eventually, the footsteps outside moved away slowly through the pine needles. I stood there, listening until the forest swallowed the sound completely. Only then did I realize my hands were shaking. I didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, I drove back to the ranger station earlier than I needed to. Cole was already there. Coffee in one hand, looking exactly like someone who had expected me to arrive exhausted. "You look worse than yesterday," he said. I sat down across from him. There was someone at the cabin. He didn't look surprised. Man or woman? Child. That got his attention. His eyes moved toward the window for a moment. "What time?" 3:40. He nodded slowly. "Did you open the door?" "No." "Good." He took a long drink of coffee, then set the mug down carefully. They usually try the cabins once or twice when someone new arrives. I stared at him. "Try what?" "Seeing if you'll break the rules." The casual way he said it made the room feel colder. The child was standing in the center of the road, exactly where the headlights landed when the truck came around the bend. For a moment, My brain refused to process what I was seeing. The scene was too familiar, too similar to something I had already experienced. The voice at the cabin door, the hand sliding across the wood. They told me to wait by the road. Now, the road was real, and the child was there, standing perfectly still. My foot hit the brake without me thinking about it. The truck rolled to a stop about 30 feet away. The engine idled softly. The headlights filled the road with pale white light. The child didn't move. She looked younger than I expected, maybe 8 years old. Long hair hanging straight down over a dark coat that looked several sizes too large for her. Her arms rested at her sides. Her head tilted slightly downward, so that the headlights caught the top of her hair, but left her face mostly in shadow. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even moving. Just standing there, waiting. My heart was beating so hard, I could hear it in my ears. I remembered the rule immediately. If you see a child alone anywhere in the park after midnight, do not allow them to enter your vehicle. The rule didn't say what to do if the child was already in front of your vehicle. "Are you lost?" I called through the cracked window. The girl's head lifted slowly, not quickly, not like a startled kid, slowly, the way someone lifts their head when they already know exactly where you are. Her face moved into the headlights. For a moment, I felt relief, because she looked normal, pale, tired, but normal. Then she smiled, and the relief disappeared immediately. It wasn't a wide smile, just a small one. Too calm, too knowing. "Hi," she said. Her voice sounded exactly like the voice at the cabin door. My stomach tightened. "You shouldn't be out here," I said. She didn't respond. Instead, she took a small step forward. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Stop right there." She stopped, but her smile didn't change. "Did you sleep well?" she asked. The question hit me like a punch. "What?" "Last night," she said, "at the cabin." Cold moved through my chest. "You came to the door," I said quietly. She nodded. "I wanted to see if you'd open it." Her tone was conversational, like we were discussing something small, something unimportant. My mouth felt dry. "Where are your parents?" The girl tilted her head slightly. "They're not here yet." Something in the way she said it made the forest feel darker. The radio clicked suddenly. A burst of static filled the truck. Then a voice came through. Old, distorted, but recognizable. A Ranger transmission. "Unit 2 responding. Norris perimeter. Request backup." The words faded under heavy static. Another voice followed. "You seeing this?" Different Ranger. Different voice. The audio quality sounded wrong. Older. Like it had been recorded decades ago. Then the first voice returned. "We have hikers on the closed trail again. Same location as last week." The girl was still smiling, still standing in the headlights. "Do you hear them?" she asked. The radio crackled again. "Jesus, there's more of them tonight." Static, then silence. My hands tightened around the wheel. "That transmission is from 1993, the girl said calmly. My stomach dropped. "How do you know that?" She shrugged slightly. "Because that's when the station burned. The same year Cole had mentioned. The same place the wet man had asked about. The old Norris station." I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. "Why are you here?" I asked. The girl took another step forward. This time, I noticed something strange. Her feet didn't move normally. They slid, like the road itself was carrying her. "Because you saw too much," she said. Her smile faded slightly. "That's how it works." "What works?" "The park." The word hung in the air between us. She lifted one small hand and pointed toward the forest. "You think it's empty," she said. "People think that all the time." Her finger moved slowly, pointing deeper into the trees. "It's not empty." I followed the direction of her hand. At first, I didn't see anything. Just trees, dark trunks. Then movement, shapes between them. Dozens, standing silently between the pines, watching. Some were hikers. Some looked like rangers. Some were just silhouettes. Too many to count. My chest tightened. The same instinct to count started rising again. I forced my eyes away. The girl watched me carefully. "You read the rules," she said. "Yes. And you followed them." "Yes. That means you're still here." Her voice dropped slightly. "But now, the park knows you." The radio crackled again. My own voice came through the speaker. "Unit 3, state your position." Exactly like before. Exactly my voice. The girl smiled again. "You hear that?" The transmission repeated, over and over. "Unit 3, state your position." Like something was waiting for an answer. The forest behind her shifted again. More figures stepping slowly into view. Hikers, rangers, people standing in the tree line facing the road. Facing me, facing the truck. All perfectly still, all silent. The girl turned and looked at them briefly, then back at me. "They're waiting," she said. "For what?" Her smile returned. "For you to decide." My hands were slick with sweat now. "Decide what?" Her eyes locked on mine. "Whether you're leaving." The radio continued repeating my voice. "Unit 3, state your position." Unit 3, state your position. The figures in the forest didn't move. But the longer I looked at them, the more they seemed to shift slightly, like an audience adjusting in their seats, watching, waiting. The girl took one last step forward. Her face filled the headlights now. "Because once the park knows you," she said softly, "it starts riding you into the night." My breath felt shallow. "What does that mean?" She leaned slightly toward the truck window. It means you're part of the patrol now. The radio stopped suddenly. Complete silence filled the truck. Then Cole's voice came through. Clear, calm. Unit 3. I grabbed the mic instinctively. Yes? A pause. Then he asked the question slowly. State your position. I looked through the windshield. The girl was still there. The forest was still full of silent figures. Watching, waiting. And for the first time since I arrived in Yellowstone, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The road behind me was gone. Just trees. Just darkness. No way back. The girl tilted her head slightly, still smiling. Go ahead. Tell him where you are. I stared at the radio, then at the forest, then back at the girl. And for the first time since this started, I honestly didn't know the answer. So, if anyone listening to this has worked night patrol in Yellowstone, or if anyone has heard of a ranger unit called Unit 3 still responding on the radio after midnight, there's something I need to ask you. Because right now, I'm still sitting in that truck, still looking at the forest, still hearing the radio, waiting for an answer. And the longer I sit here, the more it feels like the park already knows what my answer is supposed to be. The only thing I don't know yet is this. What happens if I say it?